If you told me 15 years ago that I'd eventually be making a living mixing metal bands full time, I probably would have laughed at you. Because honestly, this wasn't some overnight success story. I didn't go to school for audio. I wasn't interning at some big studio. I wasn't handed opportunities. I actually became a physical therapist first. And from the moment I seriously started pursuing audio production until I was finally able to quit my day job, it took almost 10 years. I've been running this YouTube channel for a little over a year now, and I realized something recently. I've spent all this time showing you guys how to fix muddy guitars, improve drum mixes, and get better recordings, but I never really told you who I am or how I got here. So today, I figured I'd tell you the full story. For me, this all started when I was around 9 or 10 years old. I remember seeing a year and a half in the life of Metallica and becoming completely fascinated by recording studios. I didn't know what engineering was. I didn't know what producers were doing. I didn't know what mixing even was. I just remember seeing all these giant consoles and people creating records and thinking, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. Then around age 12, I got my first guitar, and like most people, I learned by playing all my favorite songs from Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, Rage Against the Machine, Metallica. I was completely obsessed. Then I joined my first band around age 13. And naturally, once you're in a band, you immediately start thinking, we need to record ourselves. So I went to Guitar Center and I bought a Tascam 4-track recorder. And looking back, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. None. That was really my first step into audio recording. That was the first moment where I started realizing, oh wait, you could actually create stuff yourself. As I got older, I started thinking about college. I never really thought about audio as a realistic career. I thought, who actually makes a living doing this? So I took the safer route. I went to school for health science and eventually went to grad school and got my doctorate in physical therapy. Even while doing all that, audio never really left. I was still recording myself, still making covers, still recording random ideas. It was always hanging around in the background. Then, after graduating and becoming a physical therapist, I suddenly had more free time outside of work. And I remember having this moment where I thought, okay, do I spend this time trying to become a better guitar player, or do I finally take a real shot at learning audio production? Thankfully, I chose audio. So I bought my first interface, bought some cheap studio monitors, and basically lived on YouTube. I was constantly on the Andy Sneap forums, taking courses, watching tutorials, trying to figure out how people got metal records sounding huge. And honestly, learning production back then felt overwhelming. People would say things like, just compress it a little, or cut some mud. And I'd sit there thinking, okay, cool, what does that actually mean? I remember spending hours EQing guitars thinking, this has to be it. Then I'd compare it to a Killswitch Engage record or a Trivium record and realize I wasn't even remotely close. I think everybody learning production goes through this phase where you're basically just throwing plugins everywhere and hoping something magically works. I had a close friend who was a drummer, and we started recording drums in my parents' basement, and I became completely obsessed, like absolutely obsessed. Then after around 6 months of experimenting, I got my first paid work. I recorded a friend's band's demo. I tracked it, I mixed it, I mastered it, and honestly, it sounded terrible. Like, really terrible, at least compared to what I know now. But at the time I thought, I've made it. Because for the first time I was actually working with a real band. And I think that's important because a lot of people think your first projects have to be amazing. Mine definitely weren't. Over the next year, I came up with this idea. I built a mobile studio setup and basically pitched every local metal band I could find. My pitch was, I'll bring the studio to you. So I'd literally load my car with mic stands, microphones, cables, headphones, interfaces, basically an entire studio. Then I'd show up at rehearsal spaces on Long Island, and we'd try squeezing drum kits between guitar amps and random couches. Looking back, I honestly don't know how I survived that. Then after recording everything, I'd go home to my apartment, put on headphones, and mix songs there, and just hope for the best. But somehow, it started working. Bands started talking to each other. Word of mouth started spreading. And slowly I started building momentum. By the way, if you've ever thought about turning audio into a career, or even just recording your own music at home, let me know in the comments where you're at. I'm actually curious because I know a lot of you guys are at completely different stages. Eventually, my wife and I bought our first house on Long Island. I converted the basement into a live room and turned a spare bedroom into a control room. I was still working full-time as a physical therapist, but then I'd come home and record and mix bands at night. Weekends weren't really weekends anymore. I was easily doing 40 hours a week as a physical therapist and another 25 or 30 hours doing audio. There were definitely nights where I thought, am I completely out of my mind doing this? Because when you're basically working 2 jobs, you start wondering whether all this effort is ever going to actually turn into something. But things were growing. A lot of local bands were reaching out. Momentum was building. Then in 2017, my wife and I moved to Vermont. And professionally, everything reset. There really isn't a local metal scene here. I remember sitting there and thinking, okay, now what? I had momentum on Long Island. Bands knew me. Now I basically had to convince random people on the internet to trust me with their music. It honestly felt like starting over. So I started doing cold outreach. I joined Sound Better, reached out to bands constantly, and mixing work slowly started to trickle in. Then in 2018, something happened that really changed things. My friend requested Alan Douches on Facebook. We started chatting. Then I started to send him projects I was working on to master. Over time, we became closer, and eventually I became a part of his staff as a mixing engineer. And that opened up a lot more opportunities. Then finally, in 2020, almost 10 years after I seriously started pursuing audio, I was able to quit my job as a physical therapist and focus on audio production full time. Honestly, looking back, there are probably 3 big things I've learned. Number 1 is you don't need to know the whole path. I definitely didn't. I had no clue where any of this was going. I just kept taking the next step. Number 2 is passion matters way more than motivation, because motivation comes and goes. There were plenty of nights where I was exhausted, but I genuinely loved doing this. And number 3, progress happens painfully slow, until one day you look back and realize how far you've actually come. I started seriously pursuing audio in 2011. I didn't quit my day job until 2020, almost 10 years. And somehow, this thing that started with a Tascam recorder turned into me mixing music full-time, running this YouTube channel, which honestly is still kind of weird to say out loud. If you've been around the channel for a while, I appreciate you guys hanging out with me. And let me know in the comments where you're at in your own journey, because I'd genuinely love to hear your story too. Now go make some heavy music.